Welcome to Surviving a Borderline Podcast for loved ones, family members, or exes. With your host, counselor, codependency, and trauma recovery coach, Mahari. In this podcast, AJ discusses everything borderline personality disorder to help you gain understanding and clarity in any relationship type. You'll also be able to take action in your own healing and recovery by visiting ajmahari.ca to purchase and book sessions. Now, here's your host, Mahari.
Well, welcome to the first season, first episode of Surviving a Borderline. That's right. That's actually the name of this podcast. And why is that? Well, people with borderline personality disorder, they need to survive the borderline as well. They need to survive the borderline personality disorder that they are grappling with and suffering from and impacting others negatively with. And why would I say that? Well, because borderline personality disorder, among all the other causations and all the newfangled, pseudoscience studies and what people are saying, it really has more to do for more people with childhood trauma than not. Not every single person with BPD, but there's only about 13% of people that end up diagnosed with BPD that don't have a cluster B parent, that don't come from dysfunction and trauma. So it's not all about the genetics, but we'll get into several different things because this podcast is going to be everything borderline. And by the way, when I use the word borderline, I don't mean it in the pejorative. I don't mean it as a stigmatizing, oh, borderline, awful. It's just a word that isn't the greatest word, but it's the word that we use to talk about people with BPD, borderline personality disorder, and all that it is and all that happens in any relationship type with people that do have borderline personality. And so I use the term borderline, but again, not to say that somebody who is a borderline and you have to survive the borderline, that they're somehow to be just totally stigmatized and vilified and that they're evil, because I don't believe that at all. So people with BPD have to survive the borderline too, inside of them. Why do I say that? Well, because people with BPD do not have an identity. They often said they don't have a stable identity, but they don't have an identity. They don't have a self. They don't have a container of self. And as I've often quoted in other content that I've done online, I've been online for since 1995, 30 years now. And so what happens to people with BPD, according to object relations theory, which is still one of the best ways to explain borderline personality disorder, is that people suffer an emotional arrested emotional development by or way before the age of 2 years old. So what happens with this? Well, perceived or actual abandonment trauma, quote, causes the psychological death of the otherwise burgeoning authentic self, unquote. That's a quote attributed to Melanie Klein, one of the many contributors to object relations theory, but known as the mother of object relations theory. So people with BPD don't have a self. They don't get to develop and go through the early stages of childhood development to know who they are or to be able to keep emotionally maturing and to know the difference between that lack of self and other. So this brings in a whole lot of things to the relational dynamics with people with BPD that make them next to impossible in so many relationship types. Not for every single person with BPD, because many people get treatment, but for many, many people with BPD, or the patterns of, or the plethora of people now with the patterns of BPD who are getting misdiagnosed. It's getting called ADHD, it's getting called CPTSD, and ADHD, whatever the heck it is, it's not borderline personality disorder. And CPTSD and BPD are not the same. Not one and the same, and shouldn't be considered comorbidly diagnosable like both of them in one person. But all this is going on up there. So the borderline, or the person that's going to become known to be a person with borderline personality disorder, or the patterns of said, if they're not diagnosed, needs to first survive the reason for the abandonment trauma, perceived or actual, that causes the psychological death of the otherwise burgeoning authentic self. And what happens when that happens? Uprises a false self that takes on all these defense mechanisms, the major one in BPD being splitting, and the black and white thinking, the all good object, the all bad object, other. And the reason for that is because there's no container of self. There's no really gray experience for those in the throes of an emotional arrest because there's nothing safe about that. And it's all about survival. So anybody who is a borderline needs to first survive their own internal hell and pain and agony and lostness and lack of self, and the false self protector that rises up, whose job it is to help each individual person who will go on to be diagnosed or have patterns of BPD, to help them just survive early childhood, infancy sometimes, early childhood, toddlerhood, early childhood. From the perspective of surviving a borderline, it also means every single person that has borderline personality disorder has to survive the BPD in them, that lack and loss of self. And so, why do you, if you don't have BPD, and why do you have to survive a borderline? And what do I mean by that? Well, again, I'm not using it pejoratively. I'm not trying to say all people with BPD are the same because they're not. I'm here to try to disturb as much as possible the echo chamber that so many of you listen to about borderline personality disorder because of all the things that you want to hear to vilify them more, to say that they're all evil and all of this kind of thing when they're not all the same at all. So I'm not here. I'm not a BPD apologist. I'm never going to be making an excuse for the behavior, the relational instability, the relational sometimes torture that people with BPD can inflict on others. It's not always done that way. That's not always done on purpose. That's not always done consciously, but it happens. And that's what's the most important part of that. So you have to survive the borderline because there's so much that initially people don't understand about BPD. And then I'm going to say it again here. And I'm going to focus on this in different episodes of different sort of topics within everything borderline personality. Well, one of the biggest problems out there in the echo chamber is so much misinformation, so many people cutting corners, not delineating and parsing information appropriately for everyone because they will cut corners for clickbait. They will cut corners to grow an audience. They will tell you what you want to hear. And if you're only hearing what you want to hear, how's that really going to help you to know if what you're totally believing, feeling, of course, what you're feeling is pretty real, I'm sure, but what you're believing about how you're feeling or why or what happened and why did it happen? Often that's where people cut corners. I've seen some of the most atrocious information out there. And again, I'm not here to make excuses for people with BPD. Not at all. I am not a BPD apologist. But I do believe that the more that people can actually understand BPD within a construct that helps people with codependency in relationships with borderlines or in any other relationship type of somebody with BPD, that will help you to stop the rumination, the obsessive focus, the abandonment of yourself to this person with BPD, which is not all the borderline's fault. So, just a little bit about me, really quickly. I'm somebody who had a borderline comorbid narcissistic mother, and she was an alcoholic, and a malignant narcissist, psychopathic dark tetrad father who was exceedingly abusive and horrific to be around. And so there's other cluster B in my family of origin, like my father's side, my mother's side, goes back, intergenerational trauma, etc. I don't think it's all about it's heritable, but is there a component of genetics there? Maybe, and it doesn't even matter because the bottom line is people can heal and recover from BPD if they'll get into more than just DBT. If they'll go to transference focused psychotherapy, it's about the best modality out there for BPD healing and recovery. BPD doesn't need a cure like the American Psychiatric Association mumbles on about. in their pseudoscience with a hegemony of big pharma. And so a little bit about me, yes, that's my parents. I mean, they're dead now, and it's a joyful thing, really, just straight up it is. And my father's been gone for, I don't know, like coming up on close to 30 years. And my mother passed away in 2021. So I guess actually in a couple months that 4 years. So, but I was no contact with my mother for almost 35 years and no contact for 7 years at the point when I guess my father passed away. I've lived experience being the child and then adult child of two cluster Bs. And by the way, my father was a massive alcoholic as well. And so there's all that trauma and that kind of childhood that I experienced. And then I got labeled with borderline personality disorder. So I think really what might have fit for me was four core strong traits that matter. And maybe five, but probably not five, but certainly not the rest. And I just know that from my experience. But I can tell you that I went to therapy for I started at the age of 15 and it was 1970, I want to say 73 or so when I was 15. Could have been, yeah, 73, something like that. Anyways, I'm no good with numbers. So I'm not trying to be intentionally giving you any misinformation. But I started therapy at 15. Of course, there was no mention of borderline personality, or I didn't know what I was going for. I just knew that I was hurting all the time. Nothing was right at home. Everything kind of like was bad and hurtful. And I had parents that were, drunk a lot, screaming and yelling and raging. And, I was a scapegoat, but I didn't know any of this terminology. So, long story short, I leave home at 17 to go to university, and wherein I studied a lot of different things, but psychology and social work among those. And so, while I was doing that, I was also still in therapy. So, I start university at 17. I'm still continuing therapy from the age of 15. So from the age of 15 to the age of 30, I'm in therapy, different therapists, different situations, changing often, getting away from psychiatry, number one thing that helped me to heal and recover. But saying that and my general disdain for everything American Psychiatric Association, DSM, whatever, and the hegemony with Big Pharma, I'm not saying that there aren't some really skilled and wonderful psychiatrists out there that work with people with BPD and have dedicated their careers and they're experts in that area. Then there's a myriad that don't know what they're doing and they shouldn't be there. Same with psychologists, same with social workers. I went through all of this intensive therapy in several different modalities, including a really eclectic modality experience. But transference focused psychotherapy was the key to bring it all together in an experience in group therapy that was approximately over 4 years toward the end of when I healed and recovered, which which was assessed by the therapist in the group therapy program that I was in. And so I'm not saying I cured myself. I'm not saying I was quote cured. I recovered and I healed and it's been 37 years or so now, I believe. So we're getting close to 40 years since I recovered, put it that way. So what I offer when I work with clients, whether they have BPD or whether you're somebody who's related to somebody with BPD or you became the favorite person or you've been in a significant other relationship or more than one, or you have maybe a borderline mother or narcissistic father or an NPD mother and a borderline father, or and some people might just have a borderline parent and a codependent parent. And some people end up with codependency, which I talk about in my Surviving BPD Relationship Breakup podcast, as well as the dynamics between people in significant other, primarily relationships, between codependents and borderlines. And then I also have a codependency surviving cluster B relationship breakup podcast. So here in this podcast again, just to refocus to surviving a borderline, there's so many reasons why that's exactly what you have to do. And a lot of it has to do with everything that happens for people with BPD and their lack of self. It's more than just an unstable sense of identity or identity diffusion as they talk about it. So I just want you to know that on this podcast, I'm going to be talking about all kinds of topics involving borderline personality and not as much, about codependency and about people in significant other relationships and those dynamics, because I have a podcast for that already. It's called Surviving BPD Relationship Breakup. And you can find that podcast website at survivingbpdrelationshipbreakup.com. Pretty soon you'll be able to find codependency, surviving cluster B relationships at codependency.ca. And this podcast, Surviving a Borderline, the site isn't up yet, but it will be up soon as well. And it will be survivingaborderline.com. And I also have a YouTube channel, which you can find just by using my name, AJ Mahari. So if you're familiar with my work, you'll know a little bit about me. But my background and my expertise in this, I've been working with clients for 35 years, 30 of those years online. I have lived experience healing and recovery, well, what it's like to have BPD, what it's like to have the cluster B dysfunctional, narcissistic dysfunctional family of origin, and wider spread than just my parents. I have a sibling I've been in no contact with since 1988 who is a narcissist. Grandparents, like grandmothers on each side of the family with BPD, one petulant, the other one quiet. Psychopaths in the family, a lot of alcoholics, a lot of substance abusers. These are all people that I just knew as a kid that many of them aren't here anymore. And I've not had anything to do with any of the family of origin for 35 years now, which was the best choice I could have ever made. No contact cannot be underestimated in its importance to your ability to heal and to go forward in your life. Surviving a borderline is a serious thing that people really need to understand more about. And so, what you can expect on this podcast is a whole lot of insight from lived experience on my part, from education, which doesn't provide as much as lived experience. And then I also have the lived experience of having had severe codependency and of I had some healthy relationships earlier on too. But after I recovered from BPD, I did get into like a couple of really good, healthy relationships with marvelous experiences. And then I also had a couple of relationships with borderlines. And I guess it was still something I needed to learn because then I had a relationship with a BPD comorbid NPD alcoholic. And that really did teach me so much. And there was a little bit more work I needed to do, but it was around my codependency and, yeah, something to do with my mother, but it wasn't about BPD for me at that point. So I have a lot of lived experience on both sides of the fence with regard to all of this, and 35 years experience working with clients. So with all of that said, I believe I have a fair bit of insight to share, and I'm just a down-to-earth person. I keep my information and content real to help people heal. I am available to work with you one-on-one if you just want to, in sessions, if you just want to talk to me, ask me questions about a person you think has BPD, whatever the reason on earth might be. If I can be of help, I'd be more than happy to be. And you can check out ajmahari.ca/sessions for that. I'm going to be talking about everything borderline from the utter sublime to the absolute ridiculous. That's not always just about people with BPD. That's right now. I don't know which is the sublime side and which is the ridiculous. Maybe they're both sort of opposing ridiculous things. That we have a clinician out there, yes, that's right, pretty much one, who thinks himself so special or something, dare I say, that he thinks BPD and NPD is all genetic, all biological. They're born that way, and really they can't be helped, is largely what he says. So he besmirches in mere words thousands of therapists that not only believe what I believe, that we know that we can help so many people with BPD and a certain number of people with NPD, if that's not malignant narcissist, if that's more like sort of like not all the traits of NPD. But anyway, having said that, I'm not a BPD apologist, so I'll be talking about this one professional that goes off like on the way out there on the edge by himself. Because, of course, he's written books and he wants to make himself extra special and important. And so he's getting platformed on YouTube and interviewed by a lot of YouTubers, but nobody's asking him any real questions. Everybody's just taking everything he says at face value, which is not really the proper thing to do. And then on the other side of perhaps the ridiculous, so the way other end of ridiculous, we have things like professionals writing on Psychology Today and other places saying, well, don't you know that borderline personality disorder is just, it's such a special talent. These people have like so much empathy. They feel so much for other people. They have, having borderline personality disorder is really having inherent talents. It isn't. I'm here to say no, it isn't. And I'll just give you one little hint here because each other episode in this podcast will have its own topic, and I'll try to stick to that topic. Like, will we be talking about the one side of ridiculous or the other side of ridiculous? Well, both, but not at the same time. And I'll just throw in this little ditty here for you. A lot of people with borderline personality and a lot of the therapists that are so probably have BPD themselves, maybe have done some healing, but they're so sensitive to people with BPD. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be sensitive to people in general, but so sensitive to people with BPD that they're the ones saying, well, they have all these special gifts and talents and they can be so empathic. And I mean, it varies, right? But when a person with BPD is triggered, there goes any empathy that maybe they have at other times for a while. So very much compromised. But what I learned, and what I experienced when I had BPD, but I learned in therapy how to understand this, and of course make all kinds of changes and find myself and etc. That's the really short version. But a lot of what looks like empathy or maybe feels like it for people with BPD is actually projective identification. So I'll leave it at that for now, and I'll be doing an episode on that specifically as well. So I hope that you found something in my little introductory preamble here thought provoking, or even if you found it annoying. I'm not here to annoy anybody, but that happens, unfortunately. But if you want to know more about where am I coming from, maybe you've never, heard a word I've said before, maybe you're familiar with other work of mine. Anyway, whichever way, I hope that you will hit follow and like, and if you like the podcast, and this is just a sort of introductory episode, so it's a little bit more all over the place, but going to be talking about everything borderline personality disorder, and I want to emphasize I'm going to be talking about how you survive a borderline and how people with BPD have to survive the borderline that they are unless they get treatment, and they can heal and recover too, because nobody with BPD needs, quote, psychiatry's idea of cure, unquote. Nobody with BPD even really needs or is going to be served by the American Psychiatric Association a la DSM-5 or any number of the DSM with the hegemony of Big Pharma and all the pharmaceuticals, like, here, take this boatload. There is no medication that has efficacy for what borderline personality disorder really is. So I'm going to get into debunking a lot of information that just isn't correct out there, sources of information that try to play both sides. And I don't mean both sides of the fence. I mean, they try to say 1 minute BPD is like these women, like there are men with BPD too, and I'll get into that in episodes. But some people out there want to say, oh, it's just borderlines are just women, and borderline personality disorder is like a woman thing, and that's not true either. And then they'll say, oh, but these women are so hot and so exciting and so intense, and so mostly it's narcissists that say this about women with, I mean, other people do too, but narcissists try to put it off there as they're amazing to be with. Well, generally speaking, that's not most people's experience. And so then there are people who will say, oh, when the borderline gets those blank eyes, that people talk about, BPD eyes, oh, well, they must be a psychopath, right? Or at least a narcissist. No, this is borderline personality I'm going to be talking about, which is not always for everybody with BPD comorbid with NPD. It's not always, for 3 to 7% of people with BPD, it's not even comorbid with anything else in cluster B. And I was one of those, I guess you might call, luckier ones, because with the 4 core traits, I had a BPD, or if there was a fifth, I have no idea now, because they never assessed me properly. But whether it was 4 or 5 doesn't really even matter, Because here's the other thing. I'm going to just give you a little, what's coming, what kind of topics. Well, BPD remission, what does that mean? And I'll tell you one thing it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean that if you're in a significant other relationship that that's something to build foundational, oh, now it's going to be better and okay on. Not at all. And my experience on the other side there with the borderline personality disorder issues of a very traumatic childhood that I survived and healed from, I only had those four core traits, like I'm saying. And the bottom line about that is, so what does it mean? Like, I know what those four core traits meant in my life. And I had arrested emotional development, and I had a lot of BPD core issues, but I didn't have all the traits. Okay, so there's some traits I didn't have. But the bottom line is, people now say remission, it's defined by, well, when the borderline no longer has like 5 or more traits and they go down to 4, then they don't fit the criteria anymore. That's just word usage, word play. It doesn't mean nearly anything near people want you to believe that it might mean. Somebody who has 4 core traits of borderline personality disorder, which is probably all I ever had, no, that's not remission. That's not healed. That's not relationship capable, relationship worthy, relationship ready. Not at all. Because those are going to be the most primal, fracturing, rupturing, loss of self, difficult four core traits that could exist within borderline personality disorder. So, what is BPD remission and how much can you hang your hat on? Oh, that's going to make my relationship work. No, you can't. And the other thing is there's no waiting for somebody with BPD. You got to try to get them in therapy, and then you're going to wait because they're going to change, and then it's going to work, right? Even if it's 10 years later, no problem, says most people with codependency. It's just not healthy, ladies and gentlemen. It's just not doable. Unless somebody has recovered from borderline personality disorder, rare as the individual, even with a lot of treatment, but not yet at recovery, that's going to present you with a healthy enough person to really be healthy, like for it to be healthy to be in relationship with them or to them in any different relationship type. And the same can be said for people with codependency, people that enable people with BPD, people that are trying to rescue and fix them. You don't enter these relationships with healthy dynamics either. So there's much more to say about this, and I'm going to be answering a plethora of questions on this podcast, Surviving a Borderline. So with that, I don't want to make this too long. And yeah, please, if you do kind of like what you heard or the idea or the more information I'm going to give you, where I'm coming from, that I'm also a mental health professional, that I have 35 years of professional experience, not only my 15 years in therapy and on that side of the fence and in healing and recovering, and that I was one of the pioneers online in the beginning. It doesn't seem to matter anymore, but I really was. I was one of the first people online to ever talk about being a recovered borderline. Though I don't think of myself as that anymore because I'm a human being who's averagely mentally healthy, who healed and recovered from BPD. And yes, it is like 37 or so years, so almost 40 years ago now. So anyway, if you do like this, if you're interested in hearing more, please do. If you follow the podcast, please give it a 5-star rating because much is going to come that you're going to find helpful even if you don't always agree with me. And I'm going to debunk a whole lot of stuff that's out there that just is like dangerous to take in any whole way as the black or the white or the reality of it all. And I'm not here to disparage or vilify people with BPD, but I'm not here to ever apologize for them either. But I'm also going to hold everybody who's in a relationship to any relationship type with somebody with borderline personality disorder. You need to be held to account to what are you doing that's maybe not helping them, not helping you, not healthy. What can you do? What are you? How are you supposed to survive a borderline? No matter the relationship type, and it's a little bit different across relationship types, how are you going to survive that borderline if like maybe that's your adult child or maybe that's your parent and or you've had a significant other relationship with somebody with BPD. So much more coming. And like I said, please follow the podcast. please rate it wherever you follow podcasts with 5 stars if you're so inclined, because we want to build this podcast up and we want people to be able to find it, because I really truly believe, like so much of the other content I put online already, it's really going to help a lot of people. It will help people that resonate with me, and that's not everybody, but it will help a lot of people. In the meantime, just know that if you're obsessing about somebody with BPD in any relationship type, if you can't focus on you and you're ruminating and like I said, obsessing and maybe experiencing limerence, or you're just feeling so sorry for them, hey, take a break today and think about yourself a little bit more. And yeah, it might hurt and it might be really scary, but the dynamics of relating to somebody with BPD is trauma bond dynamics of intermittent reinforcement, some Stockholm Syndrome, fantasy bonds, betrayal bonds. It's not the stuff of healthy relating. So I hope that you found something interesting and that you're looking forward to more. In the meantime, take care.
Thanks for listening to Surviving a Borderline Podcast. If you found this podcast helpful, please hit the follow button and leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And subscribe at survivingaborderline.com so you can stay up to date with new episodes. Until next time, remember, take some time for yourself.